Charging an EV on the public network is very expensive here in the UK, much more expensive than charging at home, and more expensive than in pretty much any other country. Are we being taken for a ride by the chargepoint operators? As with so many other stories, we might need to look a little deeper to get a better understanding. So I did. Stick with me if you want to see what I found. Public DC rapid charging has never been cheap in the UK, but the prices took an upward turn in 2023. I remember GridServe's prices jumping twice in that year, first from 65 pence per kilowatt hour to 69 pence per kilowatt hour, and then to 79 pence per kilowatt hour just a few months later. Meanwhile, on the AC network, a number of locations that had offered free AC charging, such as PodPoint charge points at Tesco supermarkets, went from free to paid. That seemed to make sense. After all, we'd seen a huge spike in the wholesale price of electricity in the winter of 2022, triggered by the war in Ukraine, and the resulting sanctions against Russia. Those sanctions hugely impacted the price of gas, and we used a lot of gas in our generation of electricity in that year. That's why electricity prices spiked, of course. It's not to do with the switch to renewables. GridServe's higher prices were unwelcome, but fortunately I don't do much charging on the public network, so personally I wasn't too upset. After all, the prices would fall again when the panic that drove electricity prices up subsided. Sure enough, electricity prices started to fall back again, not to the levels we saw before the war, but to nowhere like the level they were at during the energy crisis. Yet EV charging prices have remained high. What is going on? I got the first clue at one of the Everything Electric live events last year. On a panel, someone mentioned that standing charges were having an impact on the price we were paying. Okay, interesting, duly noted. Then on the 13th of January this year, the Everything Electric podcast centred around an interview with Ian Johnston, CEO of Osprey Charging, which contained some very interesting detail. I've put a time-coded link to the YouTube version of that interview in the description in case you haven't already seen it, and there'll also be a link to the podcast as a whole from the end screen. During the interview, Ian shared some figures about one of their charging hubs in the Midlands, mentioning that their standing charge for that site had increased from £99 per year to £8,600 in just a few years. Furthermore, he said that their capacity charge had gone from £9,000 to £19,000 in April this year, 2025. The final figure of interest is that their electricity cost went from 15 pence per kilowatt hour before the energy crisis up to about 80 pence per kilowatt hour during it, and had dropped to 20 pence per kilowatt hour at the time of the recording of the podcast. So there's been a long-term 5 pence per kilowatt hour increase from energy alone. That's more than a 30% increase since 2021, as well as that period of 6 months or so where it was 4 times that, which needed to be recouped once prices dropped again. After all, that per kilowatt hour peak of 80 pence is way more than we pay on any network. Remember, networks have to charge VAT at 20% on the electricity that they sell us, so they insulated us from that peak for quite a while and hopefully have recouped that now. But these other charges, the fixed charges, their standing charge and the capacity charge, what's been going on with those? Well, it turns out it's all as a result of a thing called TCR. That's the Targeted Charging Review, with the word charging meaning billing in this context. This was a review of the way that the transmission and distribution costs of the electricity network were apportioned to customers. The review was started because of a concern that some large customers were not paying their fair share of the costs of running the network. Before the review, the transmission part of the fixed charges that commercial customers paid was calculated using something called triads. This was the customer's usage during the 3 half-hour periods of highest demand on the network between November and February. The concern was that some very large customers would use forecasting to determine when those triads would be and reduce their consumption during those 3 half-hour periods, either through their own generation or by demand shifting, in other words, turning things off for a bit. For a very large energy user, there was a lot of money at stake, as their charges for a whole year could be dramatically reduced by playing with their usage for a couple of key hours in winter. The problem with that, of course, is that the cost to run the network is a set amount of money. So if large customers were paying less than their fair share, then everyone else was paying more than their fair share. The outcome of the review was that the standing charge would be changed to be based on a customer's capacity, the maximum amount of power that a customer wanted to use at any moment, in order to share the cost more fairly across customers. What's slightly unfortunate about that for chargepoint operators is that they are building sites for the future. They want plenty of capacity to allow their business to grow and for us to have plenty of opportunity to charge our EVs without encountering congestion. But now their fixed costs are not based on their current usage. Instead, they are based on what they have planned for the future. A request for a capacity increase at a later date might not be fulfilled. The DNO might not have spare capacity to allocate at that point, so chargepoint operators generally have to secure more capacity than they currently need, so that they have certainty on their ability to grow and thrive. I wanted to understand these figures better, to dig into them a little bit. Can we validate what Ian is saying? Well, we don't know what site this is for, but if I were having this conversation, I think I would refer to one of the bigger sites. When making the point that Ian is making, referring to the site that is most expensive makes the point the best. If we have a look at the Osprey map, we can see that the biggest of their sites, their hubs, are all located in the East Midlands area. The biggest I can find is the Tesco Leicester hub. Here there are 11 150 kilowatt DC rapid chargers, plus one slightly random 140 kilowatt one. Let's say 12 150 kilowatt chargers to make the maths a bit simpler. But the point is, it's in East Midlands. That matters because the prices for East Midlands and West Midlands are slightly different. I've managed to find the schedule of charges for East Midlands, and the links to my sources are in the video description if you want the details yourself. And there are lots of links down there this time. The charges are within quite a long and involved document, but this is the relevant part, Annex 1. This shows all of the costs that we need. In this case, these are the figures that came into effect on the 1st of April 2024. Here we can see that the standing charge for a site depends on what band it falls into. There are 4 bands for each connection type, depending upon the site capacity agreed with the customer in the contract. But where should we be looking? The standing charge is a per day figure and in pence. Ian says that they were paying about £8,600 per year last year. If we divide that by 365 and then multiply by 100 to convert it to pence, we're looking for a figure of about 2,356.16. None of them are exactly that, but we weren't given an exact figure by Ian. There might be a bit of rounding going on, and the closest is here in the row called LV Site Specific Band 4. LV is low voltage, and low voltage here refers to a nominal voltage of less than 1,000 volts. Now I won't bore you with the maths, but this has allowed me to reverse engineer what they are paying and summarise it here for you today. These are the figures that Ian mentioned. Well, almost. You'll notice that I reckon the standing charge for 2021-22 was £41.50, not the £99 that Ian said. However, this is from before the changes from the targeted charging review that we briefly touched on. Meanwhile, the research I've done is all about what happens after that review, so maybe I've missed some additional charge somewhere, but I think these figures are indicative, if not exactly right. If we look, we can see those 2 big price hikes that Ian mentioned. The standing charge went from less than £100 to about £8,500 in 2024. And then the capacity charge went up this year in 2025 to £19,000. However, we should also note that the standing charge went down again in 2025, which wasn't all that clear. So while there is another increase in 2025, it's not quite as big as we might have thought from the overview we got in the podcast. If we look at the totals though, we can confirm that connection charges increased a lot in this period. up almost 450% perhaps from 2021 to 2024, and up another 14% this year, 2025. But this is where the story takes a bit of a turn. You see, if we amortise the 2025 connection charges over an appropriate number of kilowatt hours, maths that I will save you from, it doesn't make all that much difference to what we pay. What I've actually done at this point is calculated the costs for that big Leicester hub and the costs for a small 4-bay site. It turns out that the costs at the smaller sites are more relevant and reflective of the overall network. That's because Osprey have far more small sites than large hubs at the moment, and smaller sites can support fewer charging sessions across which to spread fixed costs like this. For reference, here are the assumptions made when doing the calculations. We won't dwell on them though, pause if you want to see those. Instead, let's get to the good stuff, the results. This is a table of the connection costs per kilowatt hour at various levels of utilisation of the site. Utilisation is what percentage of the total possible sessions at the site are being used. At just 1% utilisation, these connection charges are a disaster. That's a lot of money we'd be paying. But it drops pretty rapidly, indeed exponentially, and becomes less than 5 pence per kilowatt hour at 9% utilisation. Here's that data in graphical form, which hopefully helps you visualise what is happening with fixed costs of this type. The higher a site's utilisation gets, the smaller an influence that fixed cost has on the overall prices we would have to pay. So what utilisation can an operator expect at the moment? How heavily are public DC rapid charging sites being used just now? Well, fortunately, ZapMap gives us those figures. If we focus solely on DC rapid chargers, in other words chargers at or above 50 kilowatts, then at the end of July 2025, that comes out to be 12.7%. That's the UK average at the moment, based on time in use, assuming that sites are open 18 hours a day, a utilisation of 12.7% on average. At that average utilisation, my estimation is that connection charges are about 3.5 pence of what we pay, a bit less than the 3.77 pence at 12%. This large increase in cost makes a big difference to the operator for sure, but not much of what we pay goes on that. In fact, I'd say that connection charges are more of an indication of risk than an explanation of what we're paying. If an operator opens a site that almost nobody uses, then their connection charges could take them under. However, if they can achieve reasonable utilisation, then they're fine. Okay, so here we are, this far into the video, and all we've done is work out that changes to an operator's connection charges are a risk, but not a huge part of what we pay. So where is our money going? Right, let's come to this problem from another angle. Let's take the price that Osprey charges and work backwards from that, subtracting all of the bits we know about and seeing what's left. Okay, so we pay 79 pence per kilowatt hour with Osprey. That's our start point. As part of public charging, we are paying 20% VAT. That's controversial, as we only pay 5% VAT on energy at home, but nevertheless, it is what it is at the moment. Let's take that off. That's 13.2 pence of our total, leaving 65.8 pence going to the operator. Next up, we should take off profit. Now this is a complete guess, at least for the moment. If we assume that they want to make about 12% profit, and bear in mind that there is profit sharing in a lot of their contracts with site owners, then about 7 pence goes on profit. But bear with me, more on that later. Now we're down to 58.8 pence, still unaccounted for. What's next? Well, out of that should come the electricity charges. That's the 3.5 pence for connection charges that I derived earlier, and 20 pence for the electricity itself, which is what Ian told us they pay during the podcast. Now we're down to 35.3 pence in income that we have not accounted for. There are a few things we haven't yet catered for in our theoretical business plan. One of them is the administrative costs of running the network. Well, that's staff, buildings for the staff to work in, maintenance of the chargers and so on. I'll come back to that bit later. The other thing we really need to include is the cost of building the sites at which we will charge, buying the chargers and installing them. A lot of time, effort and money goes into that, and we have to recoup that investment. But how much money, you might ask? Well, I asked someone a few months ago for a few approximate figures. They didn't work for Osprey as it happens. Instead, they are at one of the other operators. But let's assume these costs are roughly the same for all of the operators and see how we get on. So I got two figures of interest. The first question I asked was how much a DC rapid charger costs. I knew it would not be cheap, but the answer surprised me nevertheless. For a 150 kilowatt or maybe 175 kilowatt charger, we should expect to pay about £40,000. Ouch. That's a few weeks' pocket money, isn't it? So that led to a second question. How much does it cost to build a DC rapid charger site? The answer to that? Well, for a 4-bay site, using and including those aforementioned chargers, we should be expecting a bill of about £500,000. Ouch again, £500,000. And where does that come from? Well, from borrowing. Osprey doesn't have a cool £500,000 to drop on each new site, not at the moment anyway, so it comes from financing. We're going to get it from investors, but they are going to want it back, so we need to add the cost of that finance to what we're charging. How much does that cost? Good question. Well, I'm not a financial expert, so I've had to pick a few numbers, but I've assumed a 6% rate of return for the investors and repayment of the financing over 7 years. So if I do my spreadsheet of amortisation of that, and we can achieve that 12.7% average utilisation, then that costs, well, about 35 pence. And so if we take that into account, there's only 0.3 pence per kilowatt hour left. You'd almost think I'd massage those numbers, wouldn't you? Well, maybe there was a bit of that. Okay, so those administrative costs, what about those? I parked them. Why did I do that? Was it appropriate to do so? Well, Osprey is a UK company, and that means we can see a summary of their annual accounts on Companies House website. Those might make for interesting reading, might they not? If we thumb through those, we can see that there are administrative costs for running the network as a single line item. There they are, look, just over £6.5 million, which is not far off the £6.1 million they lost for this year. So whilst I'm far from an accountant, and I'm very much simplifying as a result, the reason I haven't included the admin costs in the pricing I've calculated is because they aren't covering it. They are losing about that much each year. And by the way, that's not unexpected. The phrase is missing from this year's accounts, but last year's accounts for 2023 said this: the operating loss of £7.7 million aligns with management's expectations. They are building a business for the future, based on making a lot of investment early on, and intending to recoup that once they have slowed their rate of growth and the sites are built and running. Now I should say that this maths is not what is actually happening at Osprey, not at the site level like this. What they are actually doing is accruing costs as a whole across all sites, and then deciding how much they can recoup through their charges to customers. Their wording in their accounts makes that abundantly clear, as they are setting their price based on what the competition charges, with at least one eye on everyone else. I've simplified, but hopefully it was interesting. At the start of the video, we set out to answer the question of whether we were being ripped off by public charging in the UK, and we've investigated one ChargePoint operator, Osprey. My estimates seem to suggest that the money we are paying is all being spent, except for a relatively small gross profit. That profit is often split between Osprey and the landlords of their sites, so Osprey wouldn't get to keep all of that. However, that does vary a bit based on their leases at various sites, and they hold the freehold on a few of them. Meanwhile, overall, they are making a loss, £6.1 million this year, down from £7.7 million last year. And we know that they are not alone in that, as GridServe also announced a big loss this year, and redundancies to boot. So to reflect on my own question, are we being ripped off? It doesn't seem so to me. Some costs have gone up. Electricity is up by about 5 pence per kilowatt hour. Connection charges up by about 3 pence or so. Some goes on VAT, and each time anything else goes up, the VAT goes up as well. But mainly what we're paying for is the build out of the network, supporting all of the operators who are putting in the charging sites we asked for. There is one final change I ought to call out. The DC network is not being funded using any public money anymore, and that is a change in recent years. DC rapid charger installations were supported with government grants in the early days, we know that for sure, but it's all been financed by the private sector since about 2020, at least here in the UK. These days, the only public grants available here are for improvements to the AC charging network through something called levy funding, but that's a topic for another day. So, what do you think? Do you reckon my breakdown makes some sense? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think I got wrong, if anything? Let me have it down in that section. This week's video has taken a lot of work, so if you've liked it, then it will be a huge help to me if you click the thumbs up button. And I'd love to have you as a subscriber of the channel if you want to see more from me. Thanks.